Today, we are experimenting with turning a bug into a feature and utilizing sympathetic resonance for inspiration. For all the times we've tried to get rid of sympathetic resonance, today we are going to utilize it in a fairly experimental setup to drive us toward grooves and ideas that we never would have thought of otherwise. The audio in today's examples will be the mixed versions unless we tell you otherwise. Before we dive into the mixed sounds, let's hear each of these drums with just the raw sounds. In an effort to get this interaction that we're looking for, we've done some unorthodox things with pretty much every drum. The snare drum is the least affected today. All I did was tune it to have as much sustain as I could possibly get. Moving to the rack tom, we've pitched it for a really round note, a lot of sustain, and added a ring to the top so that it interacts really dramatically with the snare drum. Where we would oftentimes try to get rid of this interaction, we actually want them to talk to each other as much as possible because I'm trying to get a unified sound between these two instruments that doesn't just sound like a tom over here and a snare over there. The floor tom is tuned extremely low, like a couple of the screws are almost out because I want the bass drum to be activating it, and I also want it to almost take the place of the bass drum so I can switch up the rolls. Lastly, the bass drum is tuned fairly normally. However, we have a snare drum in front of it with a mic in between the two, picking up both the snare drum's response through sympathetics and the bass drum's natural sound. The sum total of this is that every single instrument on this kit is interacting with every other one pretty dramatically, and because there's so much snare wire sound everywhere, it leads me to want to play unorthodox grooves and things that aren't necessarily drum setistic. Let's hear a little bit of this kit now with some of the mixing and effecting that we're doing. The reason we are diving into a little post-production on the drums today is because while we almost always do raw sounds on the channel here, sometimes it's hard to imagine why a person might choose the sounds they're choosing and play them in the way that they are, because things are going to happen to those sounds later for the final product. We dove into this concept with a previous episode a little while back, and we're going to start to do these more consistently to help players understand exactly why we're doing some of these things when we know what the full outcome at the end is going to be. By reorganizing the roles of these instruments just by virtue of how they sound, it caused me to play in unorthodox ways and choose directions for my stickings that I wouldn't normally do, purely because I wanted that sound at that time. Having the rack tom, for instance, be very pitchy and with very little overtone ring, it felt like the center tonally of the kit and everything else revolved around that. With the bass drum being snary, I kind of wanted to use it as an accent piece rather than the thing that lands on one every time. The floor tom started to take on the role of the bass drum in an almost concert bass drum wide open kind of way, and in the mixed examples with a little bit of reverb and other things like that, it takes up a massive amount of space, almost like a movie soundtrack. Adding in the snare drum with the wires off gives me another voice that's not snare wiry and really accentuates how much brightness there is in the bass drum because of the way we've set it up. We also get the expected sound of a little wire crosstalk when we have the snares off because of that extra snare drum in front of the bass drum. And for me, I expect to hear a little bit of that in there because 9 times out of 10, I have the wires engaged when I'm playing the bass drum on my regular snare. If you like what you're seeing today, please follow the link below to the Patreon. There's going to be a lot of extra playing examples from this week's episode. We had a lot of fun. Please follow that link below. It's the best way to help us continue to make these videos. Now I've pitched the drums slightly differently so that they interact in another way to help facilitate the tonal aspect of this and take it in a more melodic direction. By choosing certain pitches for the drums, it can send you in a certain kind of direction based on music that you've listened to because of the harmony and the melodic interaction between those pitches and get you away from the idea that these are just things that we're hitting and turn it into more musical. It's also worth noting that the dynamic response of every instrument on here is completely different than it normally would be, so I'm challenging myself to balance them because the kick is not as loud as it normally would be because there's a drum in front of it, but then on the other hand, the floor tom feels extremely boomy, and this is a wonderful challenge for just your technique and your musicality. If you're a player who never changes your heads, never changes your tuning, and sticks with the same setup all the time, it's very easy to fall into ruts. And there's no better way to bust those ruts than to make it impossible for you to just play your automatic stuff on your kit and start to consider that, wow, if I want to hear that sound right now, I have to reverse the sticking, or that part of the drum is super loud, I need to change my technique a little bit. Changing the setup fundamentally like this is for us one of the best ways to get inspired as well, because sounds can start to feel ordinary to you, again, especially if you use the same sounds all the time. Do yourself a favor with your drums at home and take the opportunity to consider what will happen when you shatter your own expectations of what will happen when you play the things that you normally play. It can open you up to musical possibilities and essentially afford you a whole new drum set and all the inspiration that comes from that. This is the same way that we deal with new playing contexts, but instead we've changed the instrument context and now we must adapt ourselves to that. The sympathetic resonance that we've gone for with this setup is the glue that ties the whole sound together, particularly with the snare wires and also with overtones between the bass drum and the toms. This gets us away from the idea that these are separate instruments and into the idea that they are an ensemble that's resonating together, and every time you make a dynamic choice or a rhythmic choice, the rest of the kit is affected, generating a singular sound from below. This can seem super daunting, especially if you're a player who tries to avoid this kind of thing, but on the other hand, it's super empowering to spend a bunch of time with it, really take the monster head on and see how it's really not that scary at all and can turn into something you can utilize even a little bit and not necessarily as extremely as we did today. If you have an issue like sympathetic resonance that's driving you crazy all the time and you're constantly fighting it, consider the idea of flipping the script, go down that rabbit hole, dive into it, and perhaps you'll discover either a solution to your problem or that it wasn't a problem in the first place.